tonight, we quietly step into another world, one that is far away and long ago, and yet in many ways not so different from the world we know. We step gently without hurry, the way you might step into a room where someone is already sleeping, careful not to disturb the stillness, careful to keep the quiet whole. The year is somewhere in the early part of the 1700s, and the place is the open sea, somewhere between one coast and another, in the middle of a crossing that has already taken many weeks and will take many more before it is finished. There is water in every direction. There is sky above, and wood beneath your feet, and the slow, continuous sound of the ocean doing what the ocean has always done, moving and breathing and carrying everything that floats upon it. We are not here for adventure. We are not here for storms or battles or anything that would make the heart beat quickly. We are here only to watch, to listen, and to follow the simple, ordinary rhythm of a day aboard a sailing ship in a time when ships were made of wood and rope and canvas, and when the men who sailed them lived in close quarters and ate simple food and found small comforts where they could. We are here to breathe in the smell of salt water and wood smoke, to hear the creak of the hull and the soft flap of canvas in the wind, and to watch ordinary people do ordinary things in an extraordinary setting on a great dark sea under a wide pale sky. Slowly let yourself settle. Let the world around you grow quiet, and let this one take its place, gently like a dream that begins before you notice it has begun. The ship itself is the first thing to understand, because the ship is everything here. It is home and shelter and workplace and community all at once, and the men who sail it rarely leave it for weeks or months at a time. It is not a large ship by the standards of the great naval vessels of the time, but it is solid and deep in the water, its belly full of cargo and supplies, its masts rising up like three tall, bare trees above the deck. The wood of it is dark with age and salt, worn smooth in the places where hands grip it most often, rough and splintered in the places that no one bothers with. Everything aboard smells of the sea, of tar, of ropes soaked in brine, of wood that has been wet and dried and wet again so many times that it has taken on a smell all its own, deep and old and somehow comforting. The deck is broad in the middle and narrows toward the bow and the stern, and it is never entirely still because the ship is never entirely still. The sea moves the ship, and the ship moves everything on it in a slow, continuous rocking that the sailors no longer notice after the first few days at sea. They walk across the tilting deck as easily as you might walk across a floor, their legs adjusting without thought, their bodies balanced with a kind of unconscious grace that comes only from long practice. In the quiet of this imagined morning, the sky to the east is just beginning to lighten, though the sun has not yet risen above the horizon. The stars are still visible, fading one by one as the darkness softens into gray, and the sea beneath them is a deep, still blue, not the bright blue of a sunny afternoon, but a blue that is almost black, heavy, and full of depth. The wind is light, barely enough to fill the sails, and the ship moves slowly, almost dreamily, through the water, leaving a wake behind it that spreads and fades until it is gone. Somewhere below deck, a man is waking. He does not wake suddenly. He does not spring from his hammock with energy or urgency. He wakes the way men wake when they have been sleeping in a swaying hammock in a low-ceilinged room with 20 other men, slowly and without much enthusiasm, aware of the ache in his back and the stiffness in his shoulders and the smell of the place around him, which is the smell of men and salt and old wood and bilge water. Not an unpleasant smell exactly, just a very strong and very present one, a smell that belongs completely to this world and to no other. His name, for the purpose of this evening, is Thomas. It is a common enough name for the time, a name that would have belonged to many thousands of ordinary men who sailed on ordinary ships across the ordinary seas of the 1700s. Thomas is not young and not old, somewhere in his middle years, with hands that are rough and darkened from years of work in the sun and the wind, and a face that is weathered in the same way, lines around the eyes from squinting into the brightness of the water, a jaw that is usually unshaved because shaving at sea is more trouble than it is worth. He is not a remarkable man. He is a working sailor, one of the dozens aboard this ship, and he has been at sea for most of his adult life, because the sea is what he knows, and because there was little else in the world he came from that a man like him might do. Thomas lies in his hammock for a moment before getting up, not because he is lazy, but because this is simply how mornings begin here, with a small pause, a brief acknowledgement of the day before entering it. The hammock sways gently with the motion of the ship, and the sound of the water against the hull is very close, just on the other side of the planking, a constant, soft rushing sound that is like nothing else in the world, steady and deep and alive. Then he swings his legs over the side, sets his feet on the boards, and begins another day at sea. The lower deck where the sailors sleep is long and low, lit at this hour only by the faint gray light that comes in through the hatches and the small round ports in the hull, and by the dim glow of a single lantern hanging from a beam at one end of the space. The hammocks are strung close together, each one occupying perhaps 14 inches of the space, which was the official naval allowance of the time. 14 inches of swinging room between one man and the next, a width that seems very small unless you have grown used to it, at which point it seems like enough. Many of the hammocks are still occupied, the men inside them breathing slowly, the canvas swaying, a landscape of sleeping sailors visible in the half-dark. Thomas moves quietly, as everyone does in this space, not because there is any rule about it, but because it is the natural thing to do when you are surrounded by sleeping people. He pulls on his coat, his shoes, his hat, these last items important even on the warmest mornings, because the sea air is always damp and the wind is always present, and a man without a hat at sea very soon wishes he had one. He moves toward the ladder that leads up through the hatch to the deck above, and he climbs it with the ease of long practice, one hand on each rail, stepping up into the cooler air of the morning without ceremony or hesitation. On deck, the world is gray and open and quiet. The watch is on duty, 2 or 3 men moving slowly about their tasks, checking the rigging, watching the horizon, steering, existing in the particular stillness of the early morning watch when the night has not quite become the day and everything is suspended between them. One of them nods at Thomas as he comes up through the hatch, and Thomas nods back, and no words are spoken because no words are needed. This is a small society with its own language of nods and glances, its own economy of gesture, where a great deal is communicated without the use of speech. Thomas goes to the rail and stands there for a moment, looking out at the water, and the water looks back at him with the same flat indifference it has always had. The sea does not know Thomas, and Thomas knows the sea only in the way that a man knows something he has spent his whole life in proximity to without ever quite understanding, the way you might know a river you grew up beside, familiar and still mysterious, comforting and still capable of surprising you. He watches the horizon, where the sky is now lightening more noticeably, the gray giving way to a pale gold that spreads slowly from the east, soft and unhurried, the way a good sunrise always comes, without fuss. For a while he simply stands and watches the morning arrive. There is something deeply calming about this, about standing on the deck of a ship in the early morning and watching the light come back to the world. The smell of the sea is very clean at this hour, before the day's work has stirred everything up, before the cook has lit the fire and the smells of the galley have begun to drift across the deck. It is just salt and water and wood and the faint clean smell of the wind, which carries with it no particular destination, only distance. The ship creaks and sways, and Thomas sways with it unconsciously, his body making the small adjustments that keep him upright and balanced without any particular effort from his mind. The sails above him fill and slacken, the canvas making a sound like a slow breath, in and out, and the ropes that hold everything in place hum very faintly with the tension in them, a low, continuous note that is the ship's own voice, always present, always the same. Slowly, as the light grows, the ship begins to wake. The sounds come gradually, one by one, the way sounds do in the early morning of any place where people live together. A cough from below decks, the creak of a hatch being opened, feet on the ladder, voices, low at first, unhurried, the kind of voices that belong to men who are not yet entirely awake, talking for the sake of talking, saying nothing that needs to be said. The watch changes, the off-watch men disappearing below to their hammocks, the new watch taking their places with a quiet efficiency that speaks of long repetition. And then, from the forward part of the ship, from the space beneath the forecastle where the ship's galley is located, comes a sound that everyone on board has been waiting for, without quite knowing they were waiting for it, the sound of a fire being lit. The cook has begun his day. The ship's cook of the 1700s was a man of considerable importance aboard his vessel, though this importance was rarely spoken of in grand terms. He was the man who stood between the crew and hunger on a long voyage was always present at the edge of things, always possible, always something to be managed and kept back. He worked in a space that was very small by any standard, a low-ceilinged compartment in the forward part of the ship, dominated by a large iron stove or cooking box set on a bed of sand or brick to protect the wooden hull from the heat of the fire. The smell of this space was its own particular combination: iron and ash, and the lingering ghosts of everything that had ever been cooked there: salt meat, and dried peas, and oatmeal, and the occasional biscuit browning in the heat. The cook of our imagined ship is a man who has held this position for many years, long enough that the galley feels like his own small kingdom, a place he rules not with authority, but with familiarity, knowing exactly where everything is, where the ladle hangs, where the barrel of salt sits, where the spare rope of dried tobacco is hidden that no one else is supposed to know about. He is, like many ship's cooks of the period, a man who was once an ordinary sailor and came to the galley not through any particular love of cooking, but through a combination of circumstance and injury. A hand wounded once in a way that made climbing the rigging difficult, a captain who needed a cook, and a man who was willing to learn. He is not a romantic figure. He does not cook with joy or artistry. He cooks with practicality and routine, knowing what he has, knowing how much of it there is, knowing exactly how many men need to be fed, and exactly how far the supplies have to stretch to get to the next port. He is, in a way, the accountant of the ship's stomach, and his calculations are made every morning over the fire in the narrow space of the galley, smelling of smoke and iron and the accumulated history of 10,000 meals. This morning, he begins with the fire, as he always begins with the fire, because without the fire there is nothing. The wood is kept dry in a box near the stove, and the flint and steel are always in the same place, and the process of lighting the fire is so familiar to him that he does it without much conscious thought, the way you might walk a path you have walked 1,000 times, your feet knowing the way before your mind has decided to go. A small flame appears, grows, is fed carefully with chips of wood, grows more, and then the larger pieces are added, and the fire settles into itself with a soft, deep warmth that spreads across the tiny room and begins to push back the chill of the night. The smell of wood smoke drifts up through the hatch and across the deck, and the men on the morning watch breathe it in without comment, but something in their posture softens slightly. Some small tension releases, because the fire means the day has begun in earnest, and the day means breakfast, and breakfast means the first warm thing of the morning. Now let us slow down even further and watch the cook at his work, because there is something worth seeing in the way a man does a simple, necessary thing in a limited space with limited tools, and the watching of it, quiet and unhurried, is its own kind of rest. The first task of the morning is the water. Water on a ship in the 1700s was a precious and carefully rationed thing, kept in barrels in the hold, and the quality of it changed over the course of a long voyage in ways that were not pleasant. At the start of a voyage, the water was clean and fresh, drawn from good springs, us or wells at the last port, tasting of nothing particular, the way good water should taste. But as the weeks passed, the water in the barrels changed, taking on the taste of the wood, then darkening slightly, then beginning to develop a smell that was not quite a bad smell, but was not entirely a pleasant one either. By the middle of a long voyage, The drinking water was often green with algae, and the sailors drank it without particular complaint because there was nothing else to drink, and because this was simply how things were, and because men who spend their lives at sea learn very early that there is a great deal to be accepted without particular complaint. For the morning's cooking, the cook draws water from the barrel using a wooden cup that hangs beside it, measuring carefully, not because he has been told to measure carefully, but because measuring carefully is simply what you do when you have a limited supply of something that cannot be replaced until you reach land. He carries the water to the pot, pours it in, adds more, and then sets the pot on the iron shelf above the fire where it will sit until it boils. Into this water, he adds salt from the barrel that is always beside the stove, large, rough crystals of sea salt that have been gathered somewhere along the coast of England or France or Portugal and traded in the ports where the ship has stopped. Salt is not just a flavoring in this time and this place. It is a preservative and a necessity, and the food aboard ship is almost always heavily salted, partly for taste and partly because the salt itself performs the important function of keeping things from spoiling in the damp, warm air of the hold. The sailors are accustomed to the saltiness of their food. They have been accustomed to it for so long that they would find unsalted food strange and somehow unsatisfying, missing something important, flat in a way that has nothing to do with flavor. Into the pot of salting water, the cook adds oatmeal, measured from a cloth sack that hangs from a hook near the stove. The oatmeal is coarse ground, nothing like the fine milled oats that might be found in a more prosperous kitchen, and it is slightly gray in color from having been stored in the sack for a long time in the damp air of the ship. It does not smell particularly enticing in its dry state. It smells of grain and dust and the sack it has been stored in. But when it meets the hot water and the salt and the warmth of the fire, something changes in it. Something slowly loosens, and it begins to release a gentle, round, earthy smell that is one of the most comforting smells in the world. The smell of something simple being made ready. The oatmeal is stirred with a long wooden spoon, its handle worn smooth with the years of use, and the cook stirs it slowly and steadily, not impatiently, because there is no rushing oatmeal. It needs time and heat and the continuous slow movement of the spoon to break down the grains and make them soft, and the cook knows this, and he stirs with the patience of a man who has done this many hundreds of mornings before, and knows that the oatmeal will be ready when it is ready, and not before. The sound of the spoon moving through the thickening mixture is a soft, slow sound, a sound of small effort and large patience, and it is somehow deeply pleasant to imagine. While the oatmeal thickens, also the cook turns his attention to the biscuits. The ship's biscuit, known also as hardtack, is perhaps the most famous food of the age of sail, famous partly for its importance and partly for its qualities, which were not by any ordinary standard qualities that one would seek in food. The biscuit was made from flour and water and salt, mixed and baked until it was completely dry and hard enough that you could knock it on a table without denting it, hard enough that a man with poor teeth might struggle to eat it at all. It was baked this way on purpose because a biscuit with any moisture in it would grow mold in the damp conditions of the ship's hold within a few days, and a completely dry biscuit could be kept for weeks or months without spoiling, which was exactly what was needed on a long voyage. The biscuits the cook handles this morning were baked on land at the port before the voyage began, in a naval bakehouse that produced thousands of them at a time, large batches for large ships making long journeys. They are pale in color, not quite white, not quite brown, the color of something that has been baked without any fat or sugar, simply flour and water and salt in an oven, and they are exactly as thick as a man's thumb and roughly square in shape, though the edges are not perfectly square, because perfection is not a quality that was much sought after in hardtack. They are stored in canvas sacks in the driest part of the hold, though even the driest part of the hold is never entirely dry, and the biscuits have absorbed enough moisture on this voyage that they are no longer quite as hard as they were when first baked. This softening, which might sound like an improvement, is actually a problem, because moisture in the biscuit invites another thing that the sailors know well and do not enjoy, and that thing is the weevil. The ship's biscuit was frequently inhabited by small weevils, soft-bodied insects that bore their way into the biscuit and lived there, leaving tiny holes in the surface and a slightly musty smell in the interior. The sailors of the time had various ways of dealing with this, the simplest being to knock the biscuit on the table before eating it, which would cause the weevils to fall out, after which the biscuit could be eaten with something approaching equanimity. Some sailors preferred to eat their biscuit in the dark or with their eyes closed, which had the advantage of removing the need to see what might be moving within. This is not said to disturb your rest. It is simply how things were, and the men who ate this food thought of it not as a hardship but as a condition, one of many conditions of life at sea, no more remarkable than the rolling of the deck or the dampness of the air. You ate what there was. You ate it the way it came. And in between eating, you thought of other things. This morning's biscuits are stacked near the stove, and the cook counts them out, enough for the morning's issue, 1 or perhaps 2 per man, the number depending on how far along the voyage is, and what the captain has calculated the remaining stores can support. The counting is done quietly and carefully, and the biscuits are laid out in a small wooden tray that will be carried up to the deck when the meal is ready. The oatmeal continues to thicken on the fire, and the cook adds a little more water to keep it from becoming too dense, and stirs again, slow and steady, and the smell of it fills the galley, warm and simple, spreading through the planks and up to the deck above, where the morning watch is now beginning to feel, very quietly and without drama, the first hint of hunger. Let us stay here for a while, in this small warm space, with the fire and the pot and the slow stirring, before we follow Thomas and the others through the rest of their day. The galley of a wooden sailing ship was not merely a cooking space. It was one of the warmest and most sheltered places aboard, and in the cold months, or in the early morning before the sun had come up, it was a place people drifted toward, the way you might drift toward any source of warmth. Men who had been on watch through the cold hours of the night would find reasons to pass near the galley, to lean in the doorway for a moment, to breathe in the warm air, to feel the heat of the fire on their hands. The cook allowed this within reason, because he was not an unkind man, and because he understood the particular value of warmth when warmth was scarce. This morning, as the oatmeal nears its readiness, one of the younger sailors, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, still early in his life at sea, appears at the galley door and stands there without speaking, hands tucked under his arms against the chill, watching the cook stir the pot. The boy has been on the morning watch, 4 hours on deck in the pre-dawn dark, and he is tired and cold and hungry in the way that only very young people who have been working all night can be, with a hunger that is almost all of them, that has moved into every part of their body and made itself comfortable there. The cook glances at him and says nothing, but he does not send him away, and the boy stays in the doorway, warming himself slowly, watching the slow movement of the spoon in the oatmeal, finding in this simple sight something that is almost like comfort. The water the oatmeal has been cooked in has now become thick and pale, the grains of oat swelled to softness and barely distinguishable as separate things, the whole mixture having become something smooth and porridge-like, not beautiful, but nourishing, substantial in the way that plain, simple food is always substantial, filling the stomach and staying there, giving energy for the work of the day. The cook takes the pot off the direct heat and sets it to one side where it will stay warm without burning, and he ladles a small amount into a wooden bowl, a test portion, and tastes it with a spoon, making no expression at all, simply evaluating it the way a craftsman evaluates his work, checking for the things that matter: saltiness, texture, heat. It is ready. He looks at the boy in the doorway and tips his head slightly toward the latter, the gesture meaning, "Go and tell them it is time." The boy goes. And now the ship's morning routine shifts into the quiet, familiar choreography of the meal. The sailors come up from below, or come from their work on deck, in ones and twos, moving toward the galley or the spot near the mainmast, where the food will be distributed. They carry with them their eating vessels, the wooden bowls and the wooden spoons and the tin cups that are the private possessions of each man aboard, because in this time and this life, each man was responsible for his own eating equipment, and the loss or breakage of your bowl was your own problem and no one else's. The bowls are smooth with use, dark with absorbed oils, and repeated washing in salt water, each one slightly different in shape and size from the others, gathered from various sources over the years, bought in ports, or carved by the men themselves during the long, idle hours of a calm. There is a kind of queue, not perfectly organized, not a sharp line but a loose gathering, and the cook or his assistant dispenses the oatmeal into the waiting bowls with a ladle, one large ladleful per man, the portion the same for each man regardless of rank, because the morning meal at least was generally shared without distinction, the great democratic equality of the same pot for all. The biscuits are passed around, 2 to each man this morning, the cook having calculated that the remaining supply can support this small generosity. The men take their portions and move away, finding places to sit against the rail, on a coil of rope, on the edge of a hatch, anywhere that is out of the way of the work that must continue, even during the meal. Thomas finds his place near the stern rail, where he often sits in the morning, partly for the view and partly because the stern is one of the quieter parts of the ship during this hour, away from the bustle around the mainmast and the forecastle. He settles himself with the ease of long habit, his back against the rail, his bowl in his lap, and begins to eat. The oatmeal is hot enough to steam gently in the cool morning air, and Thomas eats it slowly, the spoon moving from bowl to mouth in a steady, unhurried rhythm. The flavor of it is simple, mostly the flavor of salt, and the faint, round taste of the oat itself, with a slight bitterness at the edge that comes from the oats having been stored a long time. It is not a thing you would eat for pleasure in a place where choice existed, but here, on this deck, in this cold morning air, with the hunger of a working man's night behind you, and the hunger of a working man's day ahead, it is deeply satisfying in the way that only necessary things can be satisfying. The way water satisfies thirst, the way sleep satisfies fatigue. He takes a biscuit and looks at it, turns it over, taps it gently on his knee in the habitual gesture of checking for occupants, and then finding it acceptably empty, takes a bite. The biscuit resists for a moment, then yields, and the dry, dense crumb of it fills his mouth, absorbing the saliva there, becoming slowly more chewable as his jaw works at it. He alternates between the biscuit and the oatmeal, taking a spoonful of the warm porridge after each bite of biscuit, and the combination of the two, wet and dry, hot and room temperature, is more satisfying than either would be alone. Around him, other men are doing the same, eating their morning portions in the quiet, individual way that people eat when they are genuinely hungry and the food in front of them is all there is. There is not much conversation during the meal. A few comments pass between men who are sitting near each other, low-voiced observations about the weather, the state of a particular line of rigging, something seen on the water early this morning, nothing of importance, the small verbal currency of men who live in very close proximity and have long since exhausted the more interesting topics of conversation. But mostly it is quiet, the quiet of eating, and around it the sound of the sea and the rigging and the creak of the hull, the ship's constant, steady voice. The light has grown considerably by now, the sun just below the horizon to the east, the sky in that direction, a pale, luminous gold that fades through orange and pink to the deeper blue of the western sky, where the stars are still faintly visible. The water catches this light and holds it, and the surface of the sea this morning is relatively calm, broken only by the small, regular waves of a light breeze, each one catching the gold of the eastern sky and throwing it back in small, brief flashes, as if the sea is lighting many small fires and letting them go. Thomas watches this from his place at the stern rail, eating his oatmeal and his biscuit, and something in him settles, the way something always settles in him at this hour of the morning, when the light is coming and the food is in his hands and the sea is calm. It is not happiness exactly. It is something quieter than happiness, more like the absence of distress, the simple satisfaction of being fed and warm enough and not in immediate difficulty, which is in this life quite a lot to be thankful for. But just let the morning settle around you now, just as it settles around Thomas, the light coming slowly, the sea moving slowly, the ship carrying everyone and everything forward at the same unhurried pace. The rest of the morning belongs to work. The sailor's day was filled with it, not dramatic work, not the work of crisis or emergency, but the steady, necessary, repetitive work of maintaining a ship at sea, a task that was never quite finished because the sea was always testing things and things were always slightly giving way. A rope fraying here, a sail chafing there, a plank working loose in the hull, a pump that needed minding. The ship was a living thing in the sense that it required constant attention, and the men aboard it gave it that attention not because they were particularly dedicated to the abstract idea of seamanship, but because the alternative, a ship that was not maintained, was a ship that might not bring them to land. Thomas's morning work is in the rigging, high above the deck, which is not a place he thinks about very much anymore, having spent many years in it. He climbs the ratlines, the rope ladders that run up from the deck to the mast tops, hand over hand, feet finding the rungs without looking, the ship swaying gently beneath him, and the view opening up as he climbs, the deck growing small below, the sea spreading out in all directions, larger and emptier than it looks from the deck, which is itself quite large and quite empty. Up here the wind is stronger, cool and constant, and the sound of it in the rigging is different from below, more complex, a kind of music made from many tensions and many vibrations, all playing at once. He works steadily through the middle part of the morning, checking and tightening and replacing where replacement is needed, the work of his hands practiced and sure, his mind occupying itself in the way that minds do during repetitive manual work, which is to say, it wanders, not far and not quickly, but in the quiet, drifting way of a mind that is not required to think, but is simply present, aware, moving through the hours without urgency. Below him on the deck, other men are doing other work. The carpenter and his mate are somewhere in the hold, working on a repair that has been underway for 2 days, a section of planking that has been working loose and needs to be recaulked, the cotton fibers packed tightly into the gap between the planks, and then sealed with hot tar to keep the seawater out. The sound of their mallets comes up through the hole, muffled and rhythmic, a slow tapping that is one of the background sounds of life on a working wooden ship, part of the texture of the day. At the pump, 2 men work in turns, operating the long handles that move the bilge pump, drawing the water that seeps into the lowest parts of the ship through the smallest gaps and sending it up and over the side. Every wooden ship leaks, to some degree, and the pump is one of the ship's most essential pieces of equipment, worked every day as a matter of routine, the bilge water rising and falling and being constantly managed. The men at the pump work without conversation, one on each handle, the motion of pumping setting a slow, steady rhythm that is almost like the motion of the ship itself, a kind of mechanical breathing. The ship's surgeon, if this vessel is large enough to carry one, or the first mate, who often performs such duties on smaller ships, might be using this morning hour for a general inspection of the crew, moving among the men and watching for the signs of the ailments that were the constant concern of long sea voyages, scurvy above all, that terrible disease of vitamin deficiency that had claimed the lives of more sailors than storms and battles combined, but also the various fevers and infections and injuries of working life aboard a ship. In the 1700s, the connection between diet and scurvy was understood imperfectly, though the practical knowledge that fresh fruit and vegetables could prevent and cure it was being slowly established through the empirical observations of ship's surgeons who noticed that crews who had access to citrus fruit and fresh vegetables were significantly healthier than those who did not. This was one of the great quiet tragedies of the age of sail, that the solution to scurvy was simple and present, available in any port where lemons or limes grew, and yet the practice of providing these things to sailors was adopted slowly and inconsistently, partly because of the difficulty of keeping fresh food aboard for long periods, partly because of the institutional inertia of naval supply systems, partly because of the expense, and partly because the theoretical understanding of why it worked did not arrive until much later. The sailors themselves knew only that the sea made men sick in a particular way, and that land and fresh food cured them, and they looked forward to the ports, not only for the leave and the rest, but for the green things that grew there, the fresh fruit that you could buy in the market and eat standing in the street, the vegetables that a man who had been 3 months at sea would want in the way that he wanted little else. For now, on this morning, on this ship, still weeks from any port, the sailors are well enough. The voyage not yet long enough for scurvy to have made its worst appearances, though perhaps a few of them have the first faint signs of it. A tiredness that sleep does not fully cure, gums that are slightly tender, old wounds that seem slow to heal, small warnings that the body gives before the more serious symptoms begin. Thomas does not think about this. He works in the rigging and thinks about the rigging, and when he is not thinking about the rigging, he is not thinking about anything in particular, just being present in the height and the wind and the view, watching the sea from above while the morning goes on below him. By midday, or close to it, the sun is high and the day has settled into its full warmth, the deck drying from the dampness of the night and the morning, the wood going from dark to pale as it dries in the sun, giving off a slight warmth of its own that adds to the warmth of the air above it. Thomas has come down from the rigging and is back on deck, and the ship has found a rhythm for the middle of the day that is slightly slower than the morning's rhythm, the urgent work of the early hours done, the afternoon work not yet begun, the midpoint of the day offering a small space of something that is not quite rest, but is less than full exertion. And with this small space comes the prospect of the main meal of the day. The main meal aboard a ship of the 1700s was served at midday or early afternoon, and it was the most substantial meal of the day, the meal that the rest of the day revolved around in a quiet, practical way. It was not a meal that arrived with any ceremony, no table set, no fine linen, no arrangement of dishes and courses, simply food cooked in the galley and brought to the men where they stood or sat, in the same wooden bowls that had held the morning's oatmeal, rinsed in salt water, and returned to service without much ceremony. The cook has been preparing this meal since late morning, and the smells of it have been drifting across the deck for the past hour. Not overwhelming smells, nothing that would make the mouth water in the dramatic way that a fine kitchen's smells might, but present and recognizable smells, the smell of something being boiled in salt water, the smell of dried meat reconstituting in heat, the faint, particular smell of dried peas softening into a broth. This midday meal is, on most ships of the period, some version of the same basic preparation. Salt meat and dried peas cooked together in a large pot with water and salt, and sometimes a small amount of whatever else might be available, a portion of dried onion, a bit of the hard rendered fat that was stored in a cask and used in cooking when there was nothing better, the accumulated seasoning of everything that had been cooked in the pot before being rinsed out with salt water and filled again. The salt meat deserves some slow attention because it is perhaps the most characteristic food of the sailor's world in this period, present at almost every meal, the foundation of the diet at sea in a way that nothing else quite was. Salt meat was made by packing fresh beef or pork into barrels with large quantities of salt, enough salt to draw out the moisture from the meat and prevent the growth of the bacteria that would otherwise cause it to spoil. The salt penetrated the meat thoroughly, changing its texture and its flavor, making it dense and very salty and somewhat tough, with a color that was often pink or gray pink rather than the brown of fresh cooked meat. When the cook removed a portion from the barrel, it came out glistening with the brine it had been sitting in, smelling of salt and the particular smell of preserved meat, which is not an unpleasant smell, but is unmistakably the smell of something that has been kept a long time. To make it edible, the meat had to be soaked first, placed in fresh water or as fresh as the ship could provide, left to sit for several hours so that some of the salt could dissolve out of it, reducing the saltiness to a level that a human stomach could tolerate. The water would be changed once or twice during the soaking, growing saltier each time as it pulled the salt from the meat, until the meat was merely very salty rather than impossibly so. Even after soaking, the salt meat retained its preserved character, its particular density and firmness, its flavor that was always fundamentally the flavor of salt, with the beef or pork underneath it, rather than the other way around. After soaking, the meat was boiled, often for a long time, because boiling was the most reliable way to cook it thoroughly, and because the long boiling helped further soften the tough fibers and reduce the saltiness of the liquid in which it cooked. The pot was large, made of iron, and it sat on the fire in the galley for hours, the water inside it muttering and bubbling, the smell of it spreading through the ship and telling everyone without announcement that the midday meal was coming. Into the pot with the meat went the dried peas, small and green-gray, hard as small stones when they came out of the sack they were stored in, unremarkable in appearance, smelling of little beyond their own particular dry, earthy dustiness. But in the hot water with the salt meat, over the hours of cooking, they transformed, softening slowly and then more quickly, losing their individual distinctness, becoming mushy at the edges, releasing their starch into the cooking water and thickening it, turning the water in the pot from a thin brine into something more like a broth, pale and murky, with the flavor of salt and pea and the fat that had dissolved from the meat into the liquid. The pea soup that resulted was a fundamental food of the British Navy and merchant fleet for centuries, persistent not because anyone particularly loved it, but because it was practical, because dried peas kept well in the hold, because they were cheap, because they provided real nourishment, protein, and carbohydrate together in a simple, stable form that a man could eat day after day without becoming sick from it in the way he might become sick from a richer food. It was a food designed not for pleasure, but for function, and it fulfilled that function reliably, meal after meal, voyage after voyage, year after year. When the cook decides the meal is ready, and this decision is made by the same practical testing that guided all his cooking, a taste here, a texture checked there, a look at the consistency of the broth in the pot, the call goes out across the ship in whatever form the custom of that ship demands, perhaps a shout, perhaps the ringing of a bell, perhaps simply the appearance of the cook's mate at the galley door with the ladle in hand. The men come. Thomas comes with them, bowl in hand, taking his place in the loose, familiar gathering around the point of distribution. The portion that comes into his bowl is substantial, more substantial than the morning's oatmeal, a large piece of the salt meat, gray-brown now from the cooking, soft enough to cut with the wooden spoon, though still with a firmness to it, surrounded by the thick pea soup that has formed around it in the pot, and a ladleful of the broth itself, pale and rich in the way that something cooked for a long time is always rich, the salt of it balanced now by the starchy sweetness of the pea. He goes back to his place, the stern rail, and he eats. The meat takes some chewing. Even after the hours of soaking and boiling, the salt beef retains a characteristic toughness, the fibers of it requiring some effort from the jaw. And Thomas eats slowly, partly because the food requires it, and partly because eating slowly is simply how he eats, how all of them eat, because there is nowhere to go, and nothing pressing enough to hurry the meal. The soup is hot and slightly thicker than water, and he drinks it from the bowl when the spoon has done what it can with the solid parts, tilting the bowl to his lips and drinking slowly, tasting the salt and the pea and the faint particular taste of the iron pot it was cooked in, which is not unpleasant, just a characteristic of food that has been cooked this way for a long time. The biscuit, the constant accompaniment to everything aboard ship, is broken into pieces and dipped into the broth, softening in it, absorbing the salty, peasy liquid, becoming briefly something much more enjoyable than it is in its dry state, the hard, dry crumb opening up in the moisture and releasing a slightly nutty flavor that is almost pleasant. This practice of dipping the biscuit in the broth was common and practical, serving the double purpose of softening the biscuit to a more comfortable texture, and of using every part of the meal without waste, the broth not being left in the bowl at the end, but consumed with the help of the biscuit turned sponge. Around Thomas, the other men eat in the same way, and there is something very steady and very peaceful about the scene, viewed from a slight remove, the way a scene always looks peaceful when you are not living inside its discomforts and its privations, but only watching from a comfortable distance. The men on the deck of this ship, eating their salt beef and pea soup from wooden bowls on a warm afternoon in the middle of the sea, have tired muscles and salty food and no fresh vegetables, and a long time yet before they will see land, and none of this is easy or comfortable by any standard of ease and comfort that we might apply from where we sit. And yet there is something in the scene that is genuinely restful, the simplicity of it, the sufficiency of it, the way everything necessary is present, even if nothing extra is, the food, the warmth, the company of other men, the slow forward motion of the ship through the quiet afternoon sea. Let yourself rest in this image for a moment. The deck in the afternoon sun, the men with their bowls, the sound of eating and the sound of the sea, the sails above and the water below, and the long, quiet day stretching out around the ship in every direction. After the midday meal, there is a period that belongs to rest. It is not formally designated as rest on every ship, but the middle of the afternoon was generally the quietest part of the day, the morning work done and the evening watch not yet arrived, and many sailors used this time to sleep, finding their hammocks again, or simply settling in a corner of the deck against a coil of rope, hats over their faces, the warmth of the afternoon sun pressing down on them with a gentleness that is almost like a hand. The ship continued to sail itself, more or less in the light afternoon breeze, with minimal supervision, and the men who were not on watch allowed themselves the luxury of this small daily sleep, this brief return to the unconscious from which the morning had pulled them. Thomas sleeps this afternoon as he often does, his back against a coil of heavy rope near the stern, his coat folded under his head, his hat over his face, his breathing slowing gradually until he is fully asleep, the motion of the ship rocking him as it rocks everything aboard, the creak of the hull and the hum of the rigging working their way into his sleep as they work their way into everything here, becoming part of the texture of rest rather than a disturbance of it. His sleep is not deep, but it is real, the particular shallow afternoon sleep of a working man who has been up since before dawn, a sleep that rests the body without entirely releasing the mind, leaving a kind of half-awareness at the surface, while the deeper parts of him drift and recover. He does not dream, or if he dreams, the dreams are quiet things, the familiar shapes of a life spent mostly at sea, the feeling of water under him, the sight of a coast he has seen before, the smell of something he cannot quite identify. The ship sails on. Let us now move through the late afternoon with the same unhurried pace, following the day as it begins its slow turn toward evening, the sun declining from its midday height, the shadows on the deck growing longer and pointing east, the quality of the light changing from the white brightness of midday to the warmer, yellower light of late afternoon, the light that makes everything look older and more golden than it actually is. the light that belongs to the hours before sunset and nowhere else. The late afternoon brings its own work. The watch changes again, and the men coming on duty make their round of the ship, checking the rigging, checking the sails, checking the course, performing the 1,000 small observations that a working ship requires to keep running. The carpenter emerges from the hold and reports to the first mate on the state of the repair below, the words exchanged briefly and practically, the information passing from one man to another without ceremony, the decision made and noted and acted upon, all of this happening in a few minutes and a few sentences, with none of the apparatus of formal communication. Thomas is up from his afternoon sleep, working again in the middle of the afternoon, now on the deck rather than in the rigging, doing the kind of work that is done close to the surface, cleaning and coiling rope, mending a small tear in a sail that has been set aside for this purpose, the needle moving through the heavy canvas with a deliberate, careful motion, the thread pulled through and tightened and pulled through again, each stitch made with the same care, because a poorly made stitch in a sail could undo itself in the stress of a strong wind, and a poorly stitched sail could tear further and become a serious problem. The sail mending is quiet work, satisfying in the small, definite way of repairs, the thing that was damaged becoming whole again under your hands, the evidence of the work accumulating stitch by stitch until the tear is closed and the canvas is continuous again and the sail is ready to do its work. Thomas has done this work many times and does it without thinking about it very much, his fingers knowing the rhythm of it, the needle going in, the thread pulling through, the fingers pressing the canvas flat to prepare the next stitch. Around him, the afternoon passes. In the galley, the cook has been preparing for the evening meal, which will be simpler than the midday meal, a smaller affair, partly because the labor of the midday cooking has been substantial, and partly because the supplies must be managed with care, and 2 elaborate meals in a day is not something a ship's stores can generally support over the full length of a long voyage. The evening meal might be another portion of dried peas, this time made into a simpler, thinner soup without the salt meat, which has been used already, or it might be a portion of dried fish, the salted and dried cod or herring that was another staple of the sailor's diet, or it might be a pot of something the cook has improvised from what is available, which is not much, but is always something. The dried fish deserves its own slow moment of attention because it is another of those foods that was so fundamental to the sailor's world that understanding it is understanding something real about how these men lived and what they ate. Dried and salted fish in the 1700s was one of the most traded and transported foods in the known world. The great fisheries of the North Atlantic, off the coasts of Newfoundland and Iceland and the northern shores of Europe, had been supplying dried cod to the markets and ships of Europe for centuries, and the trade in it was one of the economic foundations of the age. Cod, in particular, was chosen because it was abundant, because it was large enough to make drying practical, and because it had a firm, white flesh that dried well and could be kept for a very long time without spoiling if the drying and salting was done correctly. The process of making salt cod began on the fishing boats themselves, where the fish was gutted and split and packed in salt as soon as it was caught, and continued on shore, where the salted fish was laid out on wooden racks in the open air to dry, which it did slowly over days and weeks until it was reduced to something almost like a flatboard, stiff and white, smelling strongly of fish and salt. The moisture drawn out of it by the salt and the air until almost nothing remained but protein and salt and the ghost of the flavor that the fish had in its living state. This dried fish was packed into barrels or bundles and shipped to wherever it was needed, which was everywhere. The same fish leaving the waters of Newfoundland and arriving in the markets of Lisbon or Naples or London or the harbors of the Caribbean, and from there finding its way onto ships like this one as part of the supply of provisions for the voyage. On the ship, it was kept in the hold, packed in straw to protect it from the damp. Not that a little damp could hurt something already so thoroughly preserved, but that was the custom. To eat it, the dried fish had to be soaked, as the salt meat had to be soaked, placed in a bucket of water, and left for a day or sometimes longer. The water changed several times, the fish gradually softening as the salt dissolved out of it and the dried flesh rehydrated, the flat, stiff board becoming flexible again, the white surface losing its rigidity, the smell of it changing from the sharp, dry smell of the preserved fish to something warmer and more reminiscent of the sea it came from. When it was sufficiently rehydrated, it could be cooked, boiled, or fried if there was fat available, and it became something not unlike fresh fish, though with the preserved character always present in its flavor, the saltiness that could not be entirely removed, and the particular texture of meat that has been dried and reconstituted, slightly more fibrous than fresh, denser, but nourishing and filling and carrying the familiar, comforting taste of the sea. This evening, the cook has prepared a portion of the dried fish, boiled with water and whatever flavoring is available, perhaps a small amount of the ship's stored vinegar, which was one of the condiments kept aboard for both culinary and preservative purposes, or perhaps just salt and the juice of the cooking, the fish broken apart in the pot and distributed in the same bowls with another portion of the ever-present biscuit. The evening meal is eaten at the end of the afternoon watch, as the sun is declining toward the horizon, the light thickening and warming, and beginning the long, gentle collapse into dusk. The men eat in the same way they have eaten all day, without ceremony, taking their portions and finding their places and eating slowly in the evening light. And the mood of this meal is slightly different from the mood of the midday meal, quieter in a different way, with the weight of the full day in it, the tiredness of bodies that have been working since before dawn and are now entering the final hours before sleep. Thomas eats his evening portion of salt fish and biscuit sitting near the stern again, facing the west where the sun is going down, watching the colors of the sunset spread across the sky. Sunsets at sea are their own particular thing, unclouded by the haze of cities and the interference of land, visible in their full extent from horizon to horizon, and the best of them are extraordinary in the quiet, unstartling way of natural phenomena that are simply doing what they do, the sky going through its palette from gold to orange to red to deep purple, the sea below reflecting these colors back in a version that is darker and more liquid, the whole world for these few minutes filled with a kind of soft, fading fire that asks nothing of the people watching it and gives without any expectation of thanks. Thomas is not a man of many words or deep reflections, or if he is, the habits of his life have not encouraged the expression of them. He watches the sunset the way he watches most things, steadily and without comment, taking it in without analysis, simply present to it, and this, perhaps, is its own kind of wisdom, the wisdom of presence, of being exactly where you are without the complication of needing to say something about it. The other men eat and watch and are quiet in their own ways, and the ship moves forward through the evening sea, and the sky continues its slow performance above, and everything is ordinary and sufficient, and in its own simple way, complete. Gently now let us follow the evening into the night, moving slowly the way evening always moves slowly when the day has been long and the body is ready for rest. After the evening meal, the ship settles into its nighttime routine. The watches are set, the men who will keep the night hours taking their positions, the men who will sleep going below to their hammocks, or in the warm weather, staying on deck where the air is better than in the low space below. The cook banks the fire in the galley, reducing it to a low, steady warmth that will keep the space warm through the night and require only the addition of fresh wood in the morning to spring back to full life, because fire was too valuable and too difficult to start from scratch to be allowed to go out unnecessarily. The sounds of the ship change as night comes on. The daytime sounds, the calls across the deck, the knock of the mallet, the creak of the rigging under the working hands. All of these fade as the workers leave their posts and the ship goes into its nighttime quiet. What remains are the constant sounds, the sounds that are there whether it is day or night, the creak of the hull, the sound of the water, the hum of the rigging, the soft percussion of the sails, and now from somewhere below, the sound of a few voices talking quietly in the dark, the low murmur of men who are not yet asleep but are heading there, the conversation, the way conversation goes at the end of a long day, wandering and slow and not particularly going anywhere. Below decks, in the hammock room, the air is warm and close, the smell of the space asserting itself in the darkness with some persistence, but the men who sleep here are accustomed to it, and the hammocks are swaying gently with the motion of the ship, and the light from the single lantern is very low, barely more than a glow, the kind of light that makes everything soft and distant and sleep-ready. The hammocks hang side by side, each one containing a man who is at some stage of the journey from wakefulness to sleep, some already there, breathing slow and even, the canvas of the hammock rising and falling slightly with each breath, others still at the edge of it, shifting, adjusting, settling. Thomas is in his hammock. He has been in it for perhaps half an hour, lying on his back with his arms at his sides, which is how he sleeps at sea, because the hammock's shape does not encourage other positions in the way that a wide, flat bed might. The motion of the ship is working on him, the way it works on everyone, the slight left-right swing of the hammock following the roll of the vessel, a movement so familiar and so continuous that it has become indistinguishable from the simple fact of lying down, the way a sound heard long enough stops being noticed as a separate thing and becomes part of the background of consciousness. His body is tired, the specific tiredness of physical work done in fresh air, a tiredness that is heavy and warm and without any edge of anxiety, a tiredness that moves easily and naturally toward sleep. His muscles loose now after a day of tension, his eyes closing without effort. He thinks, in the vague, unfocused way of a mind approaching sleep, about nothing in particular. Perhaps the morning's work, perhaps a small calculation about how many days remain before the next port, a calculation he makes without particular urgency, more as a habit of mind than out of any strong desire for land. Perhaps nothing at all, just the feeling of the hammock and the sound of the ship and the warmth of being enclosed and still. In the quiet, it is easy to let everything slow down further, to imagine the whole ship quieting, the men in their hammocks, the watch on deck moving softly in the dark, the cook asleep in the corner of his galley, the first mate at the stern with his eyes on the stars, the sea around them going on in all directions, without limit, dark and deep and alive, the water moving the way water moves in the night, which is the same as the way it moves in the day, but somehow different in the dark, more present, more complete. The stars are extraordinary at sea, far from any land and any light that is not their own, the sky above the ship on a clear night thick with them, a density of light that makes the sky seem almost solid in places. The Milky Way, a band of brightness, so wide and clear that it casts a faint shadow. The sailors used these stars to navigate, the men who knew how to use them, the officers and navigators, taking readings with their instruments and making their calculations and setting the course by the fixed points of the sky. The ordinary sailors use them differently, as a comfort and a company, the same stars visible from every sea and every land, the same constellations rising and setting in the same places they always had, reliable and unchanged, a kind of permanence in a world where very little was permanent. The watch stands at the stern and watches the stars and watches the sea, and the ship moves slowly through the night, carrying its sleeping cargo of men through the dark water toward the distant shore that waits at the end of the voyage. And now, let us return to the matter of food one more time before the night deepens fully, because there is one more aspect of the sailor's diet in this period that deserves its quiet moment of attention, one more simple thing that contributed to the texture of daily life at sea, and that is, perhaps, the most homely and the most human of all the foods we have discussed. The ship's stores included, in addition to the salt meat, and the dried peas, and the dried fish, and the oatmeal and the hardtack, a supply of dried or preserved fruit, and sometimes a supply of something sweet, because sweetness was not merely a luxury in this period, but a source of energy and a source of the trace nutrients that helped keep men well on long voyages. In the best cases, this meant raisins or dried figs or dried prunes, packed in cloth bags and stored in the hold, becoming over the course of the voyage sticky and dark and very sweet, the moisture of the hold drawing them together in soft clumps that had to be separated with the fingers before eating. In less well provisioned ships, it meant nothing at all, the sweet ration simply absent from the stores. When the sweet ration was available, it was distributed in small amounts, a handful of raisins per man, a few figs, not enough to constitute a meal or even a snack in any modern sense, but enough to matter, enough to provide a moment that was different from the salty, savory, monotonous rhythm of the rest of the diet, enough to remind the palate that there were flavors in the world other than salt and pea and hard grain. Thomas, on this ship, on this voyage, has been given his small handful of raisins at some point during the day, and he has kept them, tucking them into the pocket of his coat, rather than eating them immediately, saving them for the evening, for the moment before sleep, in the same way that people in all times and all places have kept small pleasures in reserve, maintaining the anticipation of them for as long as they can before giving in. This is not greed, it is economy. The economy of a man who has learned to stretch the good things out, to make them last, to not consume them all at once, and have nothing left to look forward to. In his hammock, in the dark, with the ship swaying and the sounds of the night around him, Thomas puts his hand into his coat pocket and takes out the small cluster of raisins, which have been in his pocket long enough to have warmed to body temperature and to have stuck together slightly in the warmth. He separates them carefully, unhurriedly, and puts one in his mouth, and the sweetness of it is very immediate, a dark, concentrated sweetness that spreads slowly through his mouth and is very different from everything else he has eaten today, different in a way that feels important, even if it is only a raisin, only a small dried grape, only a single small pleasure in a day that has had few enough of them. He eats them one at a time, slowly, making the handful last as long as it can, lying in his hammock in the dark, with the ship rocking around him and the raisins on his tongue, each one sweet and soft and very present. And by the time the last one is gone, he is almost asleep. The transition between the taste of sweetness and the beginning of sleep so smooth and so gradual that he cannot say exactly where one ends and the other begins. The lantern in the corner of the hammock room burns very low. The ship continues on its way. Let everything grow quieter now, the way things grow quiet at the end of a long day, not all at once but gradually, one layer of sound at a time, the way a fire reduces as the night goes on, the flame going down and the coals going to embers, and the embers going to a deep red glow that is very still and very warm and requires no more fuel, just the steady giving up of the heat it has been holding, slowly, all through the night. The cook's galley is nearly dark. The fire is banked, and the pots have been cleaned in salt water and set to dry, and the smell of the cooking has faded from something sharp and immediate to something soft and residual, the ghost of all the meals that have been made in this space, the accumulated history of the galley, present as a faint warmth in the air and a gentle persistence of scent that is neither food nor fire exactly, but something between them. The smell of a place where people have been nourished, where the simple work of feeding has been done over and over again until it has become part of the place itself. The carpenter has finished for the night. The repair below decks is not yet complete, but it has been advanced enough that the ship is sound, the bilge is manageable, there is no danger tonight. He sleeps heavily in his hammock, the sleep of a man who works with his body and his hands, and who has no difficulty when the day is done in leaving the day behind. The boy who was in the galley doorway this morning, warming himself by the fire, is on the evening watch now, his turn having come around in the rotation of duties. He stands at his post, tired but awake, looking out at the dark sea, which is very dark under a sky that is occasionally clouded, the stars appearing and disappearing as the clouds move overhead. The sound of the water against the hull is very close to him, and he has been at sea long enough now that this sound is beginning to seem normal, beginning to seem like the sound that the world makes, though he is young enough to still remember sometimes the sounds of land, the different texture of them, the way wind sounds in trees rather than in rope, the way fire sounds in a hearth rather than in a ship's galley. He is thinking probably about food. Not the food he has eaten today, which was adequate and nothing more, but the food he might eat when they reach the next port, the specific foods of land that a sailor thinks about toward the end of a long voyage. A soft piece of bread, still warm from the oven, made with good flour and yeast and salt, the crust giving slightly under the fingers, and the interior white and tender, and smelling of something newly made, something alive. Fresh meat, cooked without being preserved first, with all the flavor that preservation takes away from it. Vegetables, green and crisp, the particular cold freshness of something just pulled from the earth. Cheese, butter, an egg, an apple. He thinks about these things the way people think about things they want and cannot have, with a kind of mild, patient longing that is not painful exactly but is present, a small, constant awareness of absence, a list of lacks that is kept not out of misery but out of hope, because each thing on the list is also a promise of what is coming. Eventually, when the voyage ends and the port appears on the horizon and the ship moves into the harbor and the gangplank goes down and the world of land, with all its abundance and its gravity and its stillness, opens up again. For now, the port is still weeks away, and the food tonight was salt fish and biscuit and the raisins in the pocket, and it was enough. It was enough to have eaten and to have drunk from the water barrel and to have been fed by the cook's careful management of the stores, and to be here on the deck of a ship that is floating and making progress and carrying everyone aboard it forward through the night, toward land, toward fresh food, toward the harbor. There is something deeply sustaining about the thought of a journey continuing even while you sleep, about the idea of a ship moving through the dark water while everyone aboard it lies in their hammocks, dreaming, the vessel doing its work without requiring anything more from the men it carries, the wind filling the sails, and the rudder holding the course, and the sea making way, and the whole enterprise proceeding by its own momentum through the quiet night. You can let yourself go to sleep, and the ship will carry you forward. You can close your eyes, and the world will not stop. The voyage will continue. Let yourself be carried now. The night deepens, the clouds passing and the stars reappearing. The Milky Way coming back into view above the ship, very bright and very clear, arching from horizon to horizon like a road made of light. The man at the helm watches it without thinking about it very much, because it is always there. It is simply part of the sky, and the sky is simply part of the sea, and the sea is simply part of everything. The large, continuous, unhurried everything that surrounds this small wooden ship and all its sleeping contents. A fish surfaces somewhere nearby, a silver flash in the dark water, gone almost before it can be seen, a brief reminder that the sea is not empty, that under this dark surface there is an entire world going about its own business, vast and indifferent and extraordinarily alive. The sailor at the helm sees it and doesn't see it, his eyes registering the flash and his mind letting it go without comment, returning to the stars and the course and the quiet work of the night watch. Below, Thomas sleeps. The raisins are gone, the day is gone, the oatmeal and the salt meat and the dried peas and the hard biscuit and the small, sweet handful of raisins at the end, all of it is gone, processed now by the body into energy that is slowly replenishing the muscles, the tiredness of the working day being quietly undone by the hours of rest, the body doing what bodies have always done, healing itself in the dark, taking the simple food it has been given and making from it the energy to continue tomorrow, to do tomorrow what was done today, to work and to eat and to rest and to move forward through whatever the sea offers, calm or troubled, bright or dark. This is the great, quiet cycle of life at sea in the 1700s, and it is, when you sit with it without urgency or analysis, a thing of real simplicity and real continuity, a life stripped to its fundamentals, to work and food and sleep in the company of other men in a small space on a large sea. There is no accumulation in this life, no possession beyond the wooden bowl and the spoon and the coat and the hat, no permanence beyond the skill in the hands and the knowledge in the body of how to do the work. And perhaps there is something restful in this stripping down, something that the modern eye can recognize even from a great distance, the rest that comes from simplicity, from having enough and not more, from the clarity of a life in which the questions are straightforward. Is the ship sound? Is there food? Is there wind? Is the course right? These are not comfortable questions necessarily. They do not always have comfortable answers. The sea could answer them badly, and sometimes did, and the men aboard these ships knew this and lived with it. The way you live with any large, unchosen fact of existence, by setting it aside for most of the time and attending to the immediate and the manageable, the morning's oatmeal, the afternoon's work, the evening's fish, the night's sleep. But tonight, the sea is not answering badly. Tonight, the sea is quiet. The wind is steady and gentle. The ship is sound. The food has been eaten. The fire is banked. And every man who is not on watch is in his hammock, moving gently in the dark, breathing slowly, dreaming whatever quiet dreams come to men who live this life. The night passes as nights at sea pass, slowly and without event, the stars moving across the sky in their ancient circuit, the ship moving beneath them, the water moving beneath the ship, everything moving at its own pace in its own direction, the whole enormous, indifferent, beautiful machinery of the world going on as it always has, requiring nothing of the sleeping men except that they rest, that they sleep, that they let the night do what the night does. Slowly, gently, in the quiet, everything is enough. The sound of the water against the hull is very steady now, very smooth, the rhythm of it regular and deep. The way breathing is regular and deep in sleep. The way a heartbeat is regular and deep. The way anything fundamental and alive is regular and deep when it is at rest. You can hear it if you listen, not hear it with your ears exactly, but feel it, the low, continuous sound of the sea working against the wooden hull, the ship responding with its own slight flex and creak, the two of them in a conversation that has been going on since the ship first left the harbor. A conversation without words, without agenda, without end. The cook will wake in a few hours. He will wake in the dark, as he always does, and he will go to the galley and add wood to the banked fire and wait for it to catch. And then he will draw the water and measure the oatmeal and begin the stirring, the slow, steady stirring, and the smell of it will come up through the hatch again as it came this morning, warm and simple and present, and another day at sea will begin in the way that the day has always begun here, with fire and food and the slow waking of men from their hammocks, and the sky to the east will lighten again, and the sea will continue to do what the sea does, and the ship will continue to sail, forward through whatever the day brings, forward through the water, forward through time. But that is later. That is the next day, and the next day is not here yet. For now, there is only the night, the sea, the sleeping ship, the stars above, the water below, the low sound of the hull breathing, the hammocks swaying, the fire in the galley a deep, quiet glow, the night watch moving slowly on the deck above, a footstep here, a pause there, the steady existence of a small community of people on a large sea, doing the old, simple thing that sailors have always done, moving across the water from one place to another, carrying their food and their fire and their sleep with them, sustained by the basic things, the oatmeal and the salt meat, and the peas and the biscuit, and the small dark sweetness of the raisins saved for the end of the day. There is nothing else needed tonight. There is nothing else to do tonight, but let the ship carry you forward through the quiet dark. Let the sea move under you. Let the stars turn slowly overhead. Let the sound of the water be the sound of the world being enough. Let everything be as simple and as sufficient as a wooden bowl of salt fish and biscuit, eaten out in the fading light of an afternoon on the open sea, with the sound of the water around you and the company of other men nearby, and the knowledge that tomorrow will be much like today, and that this is not a diminishment, but a kind of grace, the grace of continuity, the grace of simplicity, the grace of being carried. Let your breathing slow. Let the night come in, the way the night comes in on the sea, without drama, without announcement, just the gradual deepening of the dark, the stars appearing one by one, the sound of the water in the hull becoming the only sound, the only thing, steady and deep and slow and ancient and kind. The ship sails on. You can sleep now. The sea is carrying everything, quietly through the dark, and the morning is still hours away, and the cook has not yet lit the fire, and the oatmeal is still dry in its sack, and the salt meat is still in its brine, and the peas are still in their barrel, and all of tomorrow's meals are still waiting to be made, waiting for the morning, waiting for the fire, waiting for the slow stirring and the patient boiling and the careful measuring, all of it waiting, all of it patient, all of it sufficient, all of it enough. Sleep well. And yet, before the sleep fully takes you, let us linger just a little longer in this world, in the way that sleep sometimes allows you to linger at the edge of waking, neither fully in nor fully out, but suspended between the two in a place that is warm and slow and without any requirement to choose. Let us stay a little longer with the ship and the sea and the men aboard it, not because anything more is going to happen, nothing more is going to happen, but because there is something in simply staying, in not rushing toward the conclusion that is its own kind of rest. Think for a moment of the barrel of salt pork in the hold. It is there right now, below all of us, below the hammock room, below the carpenter's repairs, below the pump, deep in the belly of the ship, where the ballast is, and where the provisions are stowed in the careful, considered way that a good ship's purser arranges them. The heaviest things lowest, the things needed soonest nearest the hatch, everything in its place and its place known. Because on a ship in the dark of the ocean, you cannot afford to not know where things are. The barrel is made of oak, its staves held together with iron hoops that have gone slightly rusty from the damp, and it sits on a wooden chock that keeps it from rolling when the ship moves, which is always. Inside the barrel, the pieces of salt pork are packed in layers, separated by the thick white crust of the salt that has been poured over them. A generous, wasteful seeming quantity of salt that is not wasteful at all, but exactly necessary. The salt doing its ancient work of preservation, drawing the moisture from the meat and replacing it with itself, making the meat inhospitable to the things that would otherwise make short work of it. The pork in the barrel might be from a pig that was slaughtered 3 months ago in a farmyard somewhere in England, a large pink pig with bristled skin that spent its life rooting in the earth and eating kitchen scraps and growing fat in the slow, patient way of pigs. The farmer who raised it sold it to the butcher, who sold the cured meat to the naval victualler, who packed it in the barrel with the salt and sent it to the dockyard, where the purser of this ship accepted delivery and had it carried aboard and stowed in the hold with all the other provisions for the voyage. 3 months and many hands between the pig in the farmyard and the barrel in the hold, and it will be many more weeks before the cook draws from the barrel and the pork becomes part of the sailor's dinner, and by then the pig will be utterly transformed, no longer recognizable as the creature it was, just salt and protein and the dense, faintly sweet flavor of preserved pork, doing its patient work of nourishing men at sea. There is something very slow and very old about this process, this chain of preservation and transport and consumption that stretches from the farm to the ship, and from the ship to the sea, and from the sea to the men who sail it, and following it back to its beginning, to the farmyard and the pig and the farmer, is a way of understanding how connected everything is, even when the distances involved are so great. The food on the ship came from somewhere. It was raised by someone, preserved by someone, transported by someone, cooked by someone, and eaten by someone, and all of these someones are part of a chain that is as old as the feeding of people by other people, which is as old as people. Let this thought settle in you gently, without any particular conclusion to draw from it, just the thought itself. The long chain of human care and labor that stands behind every meal, even the simplest, even the most ordinary, even a bowl of salt pork and dried peas eaten from a wooden bowl on the deck of a sailing ship in the middle of the sea 300 years ago. In the galley, the banked fire breathes quietly, its coals holding the heat of the evening's cooking in a deep, patient glow, not the bright, active burning of the cooking fire, but something slower and more concentrated. The heat compressed into the dark heart of the coal and releasing itself very gradually, the way a stone releases the warmth of the sun after the sun has set, giving back what it took in, slowly, all through the night. The glow of these coals is the only light in the galley now, a faint red-orange that illuminates nothing very clearly, but touches everything in the small space with a color that is very warm and very restful to the imagination, the color of heat, the color of enough. Outside, the sea continues. It is worth thinking about what the sea was doing in the night, when no one was paying very particular attention to it, which was what it always did, which is to say everything and nothing, which is to say the great, continuous, indifferent movement of water over an enormous area in response to the forces of wind and tide and the rotation of the earth, the same forces that have been moving it since long before any ship was built to sail on it, and will continue to move it long after the last ship has gone. The sea does not know the ship. The sea does not accommodate the ship. The ship finds its way across the sea by working with the sea's nature rather than against it, using the wind the sea creates, and the currents the sea maintains, and the tides the sea produces to move from one place to another. And when the sea's nature is accommodating, as it is tonight, the sailing is easy, and the ship makes good progress, and everything is in order. And when the sea's nature is less accommodating, as it sometimes is, the sailing is hard, and the ship struggles, and the cook cannot light the galley fire at all, because the motion of the ship is too violent to allow it, and the men eat cold biscuit in their hammocks and wait for the weather to pass. But that is another night. Tonight, the sea is kind. Tonight, the sea is smooth, and the wind is gentle, and the stars are out, and the ship is making good time through the quiet dark, and all the men who are not on watch are asleep, and the men who are on watch are comfortable enough, and the cook's fire is banked and warm, and somewhere in the hold the barrels of salt meat are sitting in their chocks, and the sacks of dried peas are hanging on their hooks, and the bundles of dried fish are packed in their straw, and the barrels of water are sealed, and the sacks of oatmeal are tied, and all of tomorrow's food is patiently waiting. To be tomorrow's food, not yet. Just waiting, just sitting in the dark. Hold of the ship as it moves through the dark sea under the dark sky with all its bright stars. Think of the water barrel. It is a large barrel made of oak like the salt meat barrel, bound with iron hoops. Its wood stained dark from years of containing water, and it smells of itself, of old wood, and the minerals the water has left on the wood over time. A faint, clean smell that is the smell of drinking water anywhere. The smell that means something the body needs. The water inside it, as we noted earlier, is not the fresh, bright water of a good spring. It has been in the barrel for some weeks now and has taken on some of the barrel's color and some of the barrel's character, but it is still water, still doing the thing that water does, which is to keep the body alive and functioning, to replace what is lost in sweat and work and the general business of living. Without this water, the voyage cannot happen. Without this water, the men cannot work, and the ship cannot sail, and the food cannot be cooked, because everything that is cooked requires water. The oatmeal and the peas and the salt meat all need to be boiled in water. The salt needs to be dissolved and managed. The biscuit needs to be softened, all of it requiring water. And so the water barrel is perhaps the single most important object on the ship, the center around which everything else revolves, the thing that makes everything else possible. The purser keeps a careful count of the water, measuring how much is used each day and calculating how much remains and how many days remain before the next port, where fresh water can be taken aboard. And if the calculation comes out wrong, if the current voyage is taking longer than expected because the winds have been contrary or the course has been altered for some reason, then the water ration will be reduced, and this reduction is felt throughout the ship with a seriousness that the reduction of almost any other provision would not produce, because without water, everything stops. But tonight the calculation is fine. The water is sufficient. The voyage is proceeding as planned, more or less, within the normal variations of wind and weather, and the purser has no particular anxiety about the water tonight, which means that the cook can use the water he needs for tomorrow's oatmeal and tomorrow's boiling without any particular economy beyond the ordinary careful economy he always practices. Everything is sufficient tonight. Let that thought carry you, the sufficiency of things, the way a sailing ship on a calm night in the middle of the ocean has everything it needs, the water and the fire and the food and the ropes and the canvas and the men to work them. Nothing extra, nothing wasted, everything exactly what it needs to be, and nothing more. A kind of perfection that is not the perfection of luxury or abundance, but the perfection of exactly enough, which is in some ways a more satisfying perfection. A sailor is sleeping now with his face turned toward the planking of the hull, and through the wood, very close to his ear, the sound of the sea is intimate and constant. the water moving along the hull's outer surface with a sound that is partly a rush and partly a hiss and partly something lower and more resonant, the sound of mass moving smoothly. And this sound has been in his dreams for 20 years. The sound of the sea is in his sleep, the way the sound of a river is in the sleep of someone who grew up beside a river, permanently woven into the texture of unconsciousness, present as a comfort, as a signal, as a kind of home. Somewhere in the middle of the ship, the carpenter sleeps with his tools in a bag beside him, the bag soft and heavy with the weight of iron and wood, the tools that he uses every day to keep the ship sound, the mallets and the chisels and the caulking irons and the gouges and the saws, each one worn smooth in the places where his hands grip it, each one fitting his hands in the way that a familiar tool fits a hand that has held it for many years, becoming an extension of the person rather than a separate object. He will use these tools again tomorrow, and the day after that, and for all the days of the voyage, the work of maintenance being never finished, always requiring the next small repair, the next small adjustment, the patient, continuous tending of a wooden ship on a salty sea. The first mate is at the stern, where he has been for the last 2 hours of his watch, a steady, experienced man who has been going to sea since he was 14 years old, and who now, in his middle 30s, moves through the work of seafaring with a quiet competence that is the most valuable quality a man on a ship can have. Not brilliance or daring, but steady, reliable competence, the ability to make the right decision without drama and carry it out without fuss. He is watching the stars and the compass and the horizon, doing the continuous small calculations of navigation, and he is thinking about nothing in particular, or perhaps about the port they are heading for, the particular color of the water as you come into harbor there, the smell of the land from the deck when you are still a mile out, the green smell of it, vegetation and earth and fresh water, the smell of everything that is not salt. He thinks about this without longing, just with interest, the way a man thinks about a place he has been before and will be again, not a dream but a memory and a certainty. The port is there, the harbor is there, the land is there, and they are moving toward it, slowly and steadily, and in a matter of weeks, it will be visible on the horizon, and then the water will begin to change color as it shallows, and then the smell of land will reach them, and then the harbor will open up around them, and the anchor will go down, and the voyage will be over, and there will be fresh water and fresh food and rest. But that is later. That is then. This is now, and now is the middle of the ocean, and the middle of the night, and the stars above, and the water below, and the ship in between, moving forward, always forward, the steady compass bearing held, the course maintained, the voyage continuing. The sound of the pump. Even at night, at certain hours, the bilge pump is worked, the accumulated seepage of the day drawn up and expelled over the side, the ship lightened by a small, manageable amount of the water that has worked its way in through the joints and the seams and the places where the sea is always looking for a way inside. The man at the pump works it in long, slow strokes the handle going up and down, the mechanism drawing the water from the lowest part of the hull and lifting it up and out, and the water falls over the side and joins the sea again, returning to where it came from, and the bilge is a little lower, a little drier, the ship a little lighter and a little safer than it was before, and the man at the pump straightens his back and rests for a moment, and then begins again. This is the shape of the sailor's life, this repetition, this continuous attending to the needs of the ship, this daily and nightly maintenance of the vessel that carries everyone across the water. It is not a glamorous life in any conventional sense. It does not offer the pleasures that landlocked life offers, the stability of the ground, the variety of the landscape, the company of women and children and old people and animals, the particular comfort of a fixed address and a familiar neighborhood, and the accumulations of objects that make a home. It offers instead these other things: the sea, the sky, the company of other men, the satisfaction of skilled work, the freedom from many of the concerns that trouble land-bound people, and the food that is what it is: the salt meat and the peas and the oatmeal and the biscuit, day after day, week after week, a diet that is boring and salty and limited and sufficient. And perhaps, on a night like this one, with the sea calm and the sky clear and the ship making good way and everyone fed and most of them sleeping, perhaps on a night like this, the sufficiency is not so far from contentment, not so far from the quiet satisfaction of a day completed and a meal eaten and a hammock found and the night spreading itself out over everything with its dark, cool, star-filled quiet. The boy on watch is thinking about bread again. Specifically, he is thinking about a loaf he once ate in a baker's shop in a town near the coast, a loaf that he bought with his own coin the morning before the ship departed, standing in the warm shop with the smell of fresh bread all around him, and the baker cutting the loaf and wrapping it in cloth and handing it to him, and he carried it to the docks and sat on a bollard and ate half of it by himself with no accompaniment, just the bread, and it was still warm from the oven, and the crust was golden and crisp, and it gave under his teeth with a sound and a feeling that is absolutely unlike the feeling of eating hardtack, being yielding and soft and full of air, and tasting of yeast and warmth, and the particular sweetness that bread has when it is fresh, the sweetness that has nothing to do with sugar, but is simply the sweetness of fermentation and heat, of grain transformed. He ate half the loaf sitting on the bollard and put the other half in his coat, and by the next morning the other half was stale, as bread always goes stale, quickly and without warning, the softness gone, the crust no longer crisp but leathery, the interior dense and slightly gummy. He ate it anyway, because it was still bread, still infinitely better than the biscuit that would be his bread for the next months. And then the bread was gone, and the voyage had begun in earnest, and the biscuit took its place, as it always did, with its hard, dry, reliable, weevil-adjacent consistency. He smiles slightly, standing at his post in the dark, thinking about the bread, and then he stops thinking about it, because there is nothing useful in too much thinking about bread when there is no bread to be had, and turns his attention back to the sea and the stars, and the steady work of the watch. In the hold, in their barrels and their sacks, the provisions sit in the dark and the damp, doing the patient work of being provisions, of waiting to be needed and then being used, of sustaining the voyage through their slow, necessary transformation from stored food to cooked food to eaten food to energy, the chain of nourishment working its quiet way through the body of the ship and the bodies of the men who sail it. Let the hold be dark and quiet. Let the barrels sit in their chocks. Let the sacks hang from their hooks. Let the oatmeal wait for morning. Let the salt meat wait for noon. Let the raisins wait for the evening. Let everything be waiting, as it has been waiting, as it will continue to wait, patiently and without urgency, until it is needed. Let the cook sleep a little longer. Let Thomas sleep. Let the boy on watch stand his patient vigil, and let the first mate watch his stars, and let the man at the pump work his slow strokes, and let the carpenter dream of tools, and let the ship sail on through the dark water, forward and forward, carrying everything and everyone, sustained by the simple things, the salt and the grain and the dried pea and the hard biscuit and the small raisin at the end of the day, all of it simple, all of it necessary, all of it enough. The stars are turning very slowly overhead, their circuit so slow that you cannot see it happening, but only know it afterward, the constellations having moved while you were not watching, the sky a slightly different sky than it was an hour ago, and the sea moving beneath the stars in its own slow circuit, and the ship moving on the sea, and the men sleeping in the ship, and the food in the hold waiting to become the day's nourishment, and all of it moving slowly, without urgency, in the great and quiet turning of things. This is the world of the sailor in the 1700s, stripped to its simplest form: water and wood and wind and salt and grain and fire, the sea in every direction, the sky above, the ship between them, and the food, always the food, the simple, necessary, unremarkable food, the oatmeal and the salt meat, and the peas and the biscuit, and the dried fish and the raisins, doing what food has always done, sustaining life, making the journey possible, carrying people across the spaces between places, quietly and without drama, day after day and night after night, as long as the voyage lasts, as long as the voyage lasts. Which is to say, as long as there is water in the barrel, and wood for the fire, and grain in the sack, and salt in the barrel, and canvas in the sails, and rope in the rigging, and men to work them, the voyage can continue, and the ship can continue, and the food will continue to be made and eaten and made again, and the men will continue to wake and work and eat and sleep and wake again, and the sea will continue to carry them, and the stars will continue to guide them, and the harbor at the end of the voyage will continue to wait for them, patient and certain, the way a destination always waits for a journey that is still underway. And somewhere in all of this, in the creaking and the swaying and the steady sound of the water and the glow of the banked fire and the smell of salt and wood and the oatmeal about to be made, somewhere in all of this is a kind of peace that is not simple but has the quality of simplicity, the peace of things doing what they are made to do, of people living the life they know, of the body fed and rested and carried forward through the dark. That peace is here now. You can feel it in the motion of the ship, in the steadiness of the stars, in the warmth of the banked fire 3 decks below where you are resting, in the sound of the water that is always there and will always be there, constant and deep and slow, the voice of the sea saying nothing in particular and everything at once. Let it carry you. Let the night be long and quiet, as it is on the open sea in the 1700s, with no land in sight and no need of land, just the ship and the sea and the men and the food and the fire and the dark and the stars and the slow, continuous breathing of the water against the hull. Just this, only this, everything enough. Sleep well.